In the kingdom of Korath, they called her the grain thief before anyone learned her name. They said a woman who stole bread from a starving keep deserved no name at all, only a number scratched into a dungeon wall and a date set for the river ice to take her. They said the king of Korath had not let his wolf surface in 3 years, not since grief had hollowed him into something that ruled but did not feel, and that whatever waited for the thief in the dark beneath the keep would only be more of that same silence. They were wrong about the silence. Something in the king's chest had been straining against its chain for 11 days, and on the night it finally broke free, an entire hall would learn what happened when the most powerful wolf in the north chose the one woman it had been told was worth nothing at all. In the 1142nd winter of the Korath reckoning, on the morning the tithe ledgers were recited aloud in the long hall, Senna Wren knelt on flagstones so cold they had stopped registering as cold at all, only as a deep ache climbing from her knees into her spine. Her wrists were bound in rough rope. Her breath left her in pale clouds the high windows swallowed before they reached the rafters. Steward Garrick Thane stood above her on the dais, a ledger open in his soft hands, reading her father's name from a line he had drawn through in red ink 3 winters before. Her father had been the keep's grain clerk once, trusted with the count of every sack that came in and went out through the famine years. A quiet, careful man who had taught her to follow a column of figures before either of them knew the skill would someday be turned against the both of them. He had died in this same dungeon, of cold and a heart that had simply stopped trying, before his daughter was old enough to understand that some debts a keep invents are never meant to be paid off, only inherited. The granary records show 400 weight of winter grain unaccounted for, Garrick said, his voice pitched to carry to the back benches where the kitchen staff stood pressed together for warmth. Taken under the watch of Senna Wren, daughter of the disgraced clerk, who inherited her father's keys and, it seems, his appetite for theft. It was not true. Senna had counted that grain herself, twice, the week before the shortage was discovered, and both times the number had matched to the last measure. She had said so to the steward's clerks, to the kitchen master, to anyone in the keep who would stand still long enough to hear her, and not one of them had looked at her the way a person looks at someone telling the truth. I counted it myself, she said now, because silence had never once protected her, and she saw no reason to start trusting it today. Twice. The number was whole both times. You have the tallies in your own hands, steward, if you care to compare them honestly. A ripple of laughter moved through the gathered hall, ugly and quiet, the kind that did not need volume to land. Somewhere near the back, a man's voice, rough with the particular cruelty of someone enjoying another person's ruin, called out that thieves always counted their own work whole. A child near the front, too young to understand the shape of what was happening, was hushed by her mother with a hand pressed firm over her mouth, as though even watching this required a kind of permission the keep had not granted. Garrick did not smile, which was somehow worse than if he had. He only looked at her with the patient disappointment of a man delivering a verdict he had decided weeks ago, and was only now getting around to announcing. The dungeon, until the hollow moon, he said. Let the cold finish what the law will not trouble itself to. Above them both, on the high seat that had stood empty of warmth for 3 winters, King Bram Ashvale watched the proceedings with the flat attention of a man counting the boards in the floor, rather than the woman kneeling on them. He had not spoken since the reading began. He rarely spoke during tithe matters at all, and the hall had long since stopped expecting him to. The silent king, they called him behind cupped hands, and worse things besides, though never where the iron at his hip could hear. Senna did not look at him. She had learned young that looking at power only taught power your face, and there was no profit in being known by a king who let stewards decide who starved in the dark. She kept her eyes on the stone instead, on a small chip near her knee shaped almost like a leaf, and let 2 guards haul her upright by the rope at her wrists. If you have ever been certain of something true and watched a room decide to believe the lie instead, you already know the particular weight Senna carried down those stairs. Keep that weight in mind. It will matter again before the night is through. She would think later that the strangest part of being marched to the dungeon was how ordinary the corridor looked. Same gray stone as the kitchen passage, same draught under the same ill-fitted doors. The only difference was the smell, a low mineral cold with something sour beneath it. The particular rod of hope going unused for years at a stretch. The guards left her in a cell with a single barred window too high to reach and a floor of packed dirt that had swallowed worse women than her without complaint. The door shut with a sound she felt in her teeth, and for a long while she simply sat with her back against the stone, listening to water drip somewhere out of sight and counting the small gray shapes that might have been rats or might have been nothing at all. For 3 days, no one came but a boy, who slid a heel of stale bread under the door at dusk and refused to meet her eyes. She scratched a line into the wall each evening, less to mark the days than to prove to herself she had survived them, until the wall beside her straw carried a small, ragged fence of marks that meant nothing to anyone but her. On the 4th day, an old man with a ring of keys at his belt crouched at the bars instead, set down a clay cup of something that was almost broth, and studied her face with an attention nobody else in the keep had spared her in a decade. "You have your mother's chin," he said. "I knew her, when I was young enough to still have a wife, and she still kept a still room full of remedies nobody in this keep deserved." His name was Pell, and he had kept the Korath dungeon for 31 years, long enough to have buried 2 stewards and outlasted a king's worth of cruelty that moved through this corridor like weather. He told her this in pieces over the following nights, never staying long enough to be noticed missing from his post, always leaving a little more in the cup than the steward's ration sheet allowed. "They will not let me bring you a blanket," he admitted on the 7th night, crouched at the bars with his lantern turned low. "Garrick counts the linen same as he counts the grain, but the cold kills slower than they think, if a body has something to hold on to." She held on to very little in that cell, mostly the conviction that she had not stolen anything and the increasingly thin hope that conviction would someday matter to someone with the power to act on it. She held on to the memory of her father's ink-stained hands, patient over a ledger column. She held on to the small chip of stone near her knee, which she had found again on this floor too, because apparently every cell in Korath was cut from the same quarry of small, cruel coincidences. Hope, in her experience, was a debt collected at interest she could not afford, and still some stubborn corner of her kept borrowing against it anyway. On the 11th night, something changed in the dark. She woke to the sound of breathing that was not her own, low and even, close enough that she felt its warmth before she understood what she was hearing. She went still the way prey goes still, every muscle locked, certain a rat had grown to the size of her worst imagining, and then her eyes adjusted enough to make out the shape lying along the wall beside her straw. It was a wolf. Not the rangy gray things that sometimes howled beyond the keep's walls in deep winter, but something built on a different scale entirely, black, furred, and enormous, its shoulder alone nearly the height of her own kneeling body. Its eyes, when they opened to find hers, a low-banked amber that seemed to hold its own small fire. She did not scream. Later she would not be able to explain why, except that the wolf's stillness asked something of her that fear could not answer, and her body answered it before her mind caught up enough to argue. She held very still. The wolf held stiller. Somewhere beneath her ribs, in a place she had no name for, something turned over like a key, finding its lock for the first time, a warmth that had no business existing in a cell this cold, gone again almost before she could be certain she had felt it at all. "You should not be here," she whispered, because someone had to say something and the wolf clearly was not going to. The wolf only lay down closer, its great head settling near her bound wrists, and did not leave again until the gray light through the high window told her morning had come and gone, without anyone noticing what had slept beside her all night. The wolf returned the next night, and the one after that, always arriving after the keep had gone quiet and always gone before the guard changed at dawn. Senna told no one. She had learned that anything good which happened to her in this keep tended to become a weapon in someone else's hand the moment it was spoken aloud, and she was not willing to lose the one warm thing in her cell to Garrick's ledger of grievances. She learned, in pieces, that she was not the only soul the dungeon had swallowed that winter. 2 cells down, behind a door, even Pell seemed reluctant to open. A tithe debtor's daughter no older than 8 sat out her father's unpaid grain debt in a cell built for grown criminals, because Korath law made no separate provision for children whose parents had failed to pay what the keep demanded. Her name was Liddy. She did not speak much, and on the mornings the guards changed shift roughly, dragging the debtors out for the count with more force than the task required. She flinched in a way that told Senna everything about how the last debtor's child in that cell had been handled. Senna began saving half her bread for the girl, passing it through the gap beneath the dividing wall after the candles were doused. And in return, Liddy had started humming, very softly, an old work song Senna's own mother used to hum over the wash basin. On the morning the new underguard, a thick-necked man named Joss who had only worked the dungeon a fortnight, decided Liddy was moving too slowly down the corridor, Senna did not think before she acted. She stepped between the girl and his raised hand, took the blow meant for small shoulders across her own braced arm instead, and held the guard's furious stare without looking away even as pain bloomed white up to her elbow. "She is 8, Senna said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Strike me again if you need to strike something. I will still be standing." The guard did not strike again. He looked for a moment, almost uncertain what to do with a prisoner who had not flinched, and then he shoved past her and finished the count in silence. Word of it reached the upper keep within the hour, the way every small defiance in a place like Korath traveled faster than any official report ever could. And by evening, Pell arrived at her bars with an unreadable look on his weathered face. "The king's man heard," he said. "Captain Edrin. He does not miss much that happens in this dungeon, whatever the rest of the keep believes about who pays attention down here." She had not met Captain Edrin, but she had heard the name attached to the king's shadow often enough to know what it meant that he had noticed. She did not let herself hope it meant anything more than one soldier's passing curiosity. Hope, she reminded herself again, was a debt collected at interest she could not afford. That night the wolf came again, and for the first time it pressed its great head deliberately against her bruised arm, holding there with a stillness that felt almost like an apology offered in the only language it had. She did not know yet that the man wearing that wolf's bones during daylight hours had heard of a kitchen thief taking a blow meant for a child, and that something in him long gone quiet had stirred badly at the telling. 3 nights later, the wolf did not come alone. Senna woke to the scrape of a key in a lock that had no business turning after midnight, and went rigid with the particular dread of a prisoner who has learned that visitors after dark rarely bring good news. But it was not a guard who stepped through the gap in her cell door. It was a man, tall enough to fill the doorway, wrapped in a dark fur-lined coat that carried the faint smell of cold iron and wood smoke. His face mostly shadow, except where a low lantern caught the crooked line of an old broken nose and the gray eyes above it. She knew him at once, though she had only ever seen him from a distance, seated and silent above a hall full of people deciding her fate. The king did not announce himself. He simply stood in the doorway of her cell, looking at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he has been turning over for 11 days and has not yet decided whether to admire or fear. "You took a blow meant for a child," he said. It was not a question. "She is 8, Senna answered, because apparently that was the only explanation she had for any of it. Someone needed to. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and quickly smothered. The way a man banks a fire he does not want anyone to know is still burning. He did not come closer. He did not need to. The air in the small cell had gone strange and charged the moment he crossed the threshold, thick with something she had no name for, and every instinct in her body recognized anyway. A held breath neither of them seemed willing to be first to release. "My wolf has not chosen anyone in 3 years," he said finally, low enough that she had to lean toward him to catch it. "He came to you 11 nights ago and has not left your floor since. I do not know what to make of that." "Neither do I," she admitted. For a long moment neither of them said anything else. She was aware, in a way that made her face go warm despite the cold stone at her back, of the careful distance he kept, and the equally careful way his gaze had not once left her face, as though looking away might cost him something he was not prepared to lose. Her pulse had picked up a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear, and she hated, faintly, how little she hated it. "The steward says I stole grain," she said, because the silence had grown too large to sit inside. "I know what the steward says." His jaw tightened, a small fracture in an otherwise unreadable face. "I have not yet decided what I believe." It was not the reassurance she wanted, but it was more honesty than the entire long haul had offered her in 11 days, and something in her chest loosened slightly to receive it. He left before the watch changed, the way the wolf always had, and she spent the rest of that night replaying the particular weight of his attention, rather than sleeping, turning it over the way Pell turned a key, searching for the lock it was meant to open. The visits continued after that, never announced, never explained to anyone but the two of them. He came perhaps once every 3 nights, sometimes only long enough to ask whether Pell's broth had improved, sometimes long enough to sit with his back against the bars while she described, haltingly at first, the columns of figures her father had taught her to follow before the keep, decided that skill made him dangerous instead of useful. He never touched her in those early visits. He seemed, if anything, careful not to, as though he understood that whatever was building between them deserved to arrive on its own and not be rushed by a king's impatience. Captain Edrin began appearing at odd hours too, ostensibly checking the dungeon's locks, though Senna noticed he always seemed to find a reason to linger near her cell longer than the locks required, and that he never once reported what he saw to Garrick. "The steward keeps his own count of the grain stores," Edrin told her once, his voice pitched low enough that even Pell, 2 cells down, would not catch it. "A count that does not always match the one given to the king. I have wondered, more than once, whose shortage truly emptied that granary 3 winters ago." He did not finish the thought aloud, but she understood it well enough. Her father had not been a thief. Someone else had simply needed a name to attach to a missing weight of grain, and a disgraced clerk's grieving daughter had made a convenient second name 3 winters later when the count came up short again. Word of the king's nightly visits to the dungeon could not stay contained forever, not in a keep where every servant traded gossip the way other places traded coin. It reached Garrick within a fortnight, and the steward's response was immediate and precise. The kind of swift correction a man only manages when he has been planning for this contingency longer than anyone realized. He called a full council session, including the foreign envoy currently lodged in the keep's eastern wing, to negotiate a grain treaty between Carath and the river kingdoms to the south. Envoy Doran of the Grey-Water Pack was a broad-shouldered man with the patient, assessing stare of someone who had outlived several alliances built on promises that did not hold, and he watched the proceedings now with open skepticism creasing his weathered face. "It has come to my attention," Garrick said from the same dais where he had announced Senna's sentence, "that our king's wolf has taken an unfortunate interest in the condemned thief currently held below. I raise this not to embarrass His Majesty, but because the treaty under negotiation depends on the Greywater envoy's confidence that Korath's crown remains stable, predictable, and unburdened by scandal." A murmur moved through the hall, sharper this time, edged with the particular cruelty of an audience that sensed a spectacle building. Isel, a noblewoman whose family had long angled for influence at court, and who had made no secret of her own hopes regarding the king's eventual remarriage, rose from her bench with the smooth confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "A wolfless thief," she said, loud enough to carry, claiming the attention of the most powerful bond in the north. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but even a starving wolf does not mistake carrion for a meal twice." Doran's stare sharpened at that, though not in the direction Garrick had hoped. "I have sat through a great many councils," the envoy said, "and I have learned that the loudest accusations are rarely the most honest ones. Show me your granary ledgers before I sign anything bearing Korath's seal, steward. Numbers do not flatter or insult anyone. They simply tell the truth, or they do not." Garrick's composure did not crack, but something in the set of his shoulders went a fraction more rigid. He promised the ledgers would be made available, in time, once the matter of the condemned woman's sentence had been properly resolved, and the council moved on as though the request had already been answered. It was the second time Senna's name had been wrapped in contempt before a full hall, though she was not present to hear it directly, only to feel its consequences arrive at her cell door the following morning in the form of doubled guard, a tightened ration, and Pell's grim face delivering the news that the council had set her execution for the night of the hollow moon, 7 days hence, framing it as overdue justice the king's distraction had delayed too long already. "They are calling it the thief's death," Pell told her, his old hands unsteady on the bars. "Drowned under the river ice, the old way, before witnesses, to settle the question of the bond once and for all. A condemned thief cannot be claimed, the law says. They mean to make certain there is nothing left to claim. If you have ever watched the people meant to protect you instead protect only themselves, you know the particular cold that settled into Senna's chest at that news. It is not the cold of the dungeon. It does not leave when the dungeon does. Keep it close. It will matter at the river." That night, Pell brought her something other than bread. A small leather-bound book, its pages soft with water damage, the handwriting inside unmistakably her mother's. "Your mother left this with me the winter she died," he admitted. "Said a healer's knowledge belonged to someone who would use it kindly, and asked me to keep it safe until the right person came looking. I think, perhaps, that was meant to be you, though it has taken me a great many years to admit I might simply have been waiting for a reason rather than growing too old to remember why I kept it at all." Inside, among recipes for fever tinctures and notes on caring for an injured limb, Senna found a single page devoted to a root the keep's older healers called dusk root, its properties listed in her mother's careful hand. "Taken in small doses over time," the entry explained, "it dulls the bond between wolf and self, suppresses the change, mutes what the body knows long before the mind notices anything missing." The cure was listed beneath it, a tincture of 3 plain ingredients any kitchen kept on hand, the kind of remedy that would have been common knowledge among the old pack healers before someone had reason to make the keep forget it. "My grandmother served the old pack healers, before the line was scattered and their houses given to men who preferred their cures forgotten," Pell added, watching her trace the careful letters. "Your mother carried more of that knowledge than this keep ever gave her credit for. I suspect, looking at you now, she was not the last to carry it." She did not yet understand why the steward's wine cellar always smelled faintly of the same bitter root her mother had warned against. She would understand within the week, and by then it would nearly be too late to matter. The truth about the wine arrived 3 nights before the hollow moon, delivered not by Pell or Edrin, but by the king himself, who arrived at her cell with none of his usual quiet control intact. "I have been drinking duskroot tincture for 3 years," he said, before she had even fully woken, his voice rough in a way she had not heard from him before. mixed into my evening cup by a hand I trusted to pour it. I believed my silence was grief. I have only just learned it may have been poison wearing grief's face. She showed him her mother's notes with hands that shook more than she wanted them to. He studied the entry on Duskroot twice, his jaw working, and when he finally looked up, his gray eyes held something that frightened her more than his coldness ever had. A fury banked so deep it had gone past heat into something glacial and absolute. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years my wolf could not surface, not since the season my wife died of what the healers called a sudden fever. 3 years Garrick has kept his hand on the pour. The pieces did not need to be spoken aloud for either of them to see the full shape of them. A grain shortage 3 winters ago, conveniently blamed on a clerk who could not defend himself, and a queen's sudden fever the same season, conveniently followed by a king, too, grief hollowed to look closely at his own steward's books. A second shortage now, blamed on the clerk's daughter, timed precisely to a moment when the king's wolf had finally begun stirring again, despite years of careful poisoning meant to keep it sleeping. He cannot let your wolf wake fully, Senna said slowly. Not while there is still grain unaccounted for that points back to him. No, the king agreed. Which means he cannot let you live long enough to be questioned properly, and he cannot let my wolf claim you publicly without exposing exactly how long he has been controlling what I do and do not feel. He reached for her hand then, the first time he had ever touched her, his fingers closing around hers with a careful pressure that asked rather than took. Warmth spread up her arm at the contact. Sudden and total, a spark that had no business living in a place this cold, and for a long moment neither of them moved, caught in a stillness that felt like the held breath before a door finally opens. I want you, he said, low and rough, the words coming out of him like something forced through an old hurt he had been guarding for years. Not the wolf's choosing alone. Mine. I have wanted to say that since the 11th night, and have not had the courage of a man half my rank. Her heart had taken up a rhythm she could feel in her own throat, fast and unsteady, and the heat of his hand around hers seemed to reach somewhere far deeper than her skin. She did not have an answer ready for that. Only the strange new ache of being wanted by someone whose attention she had spent 11 days trying not to hope for, and the careful certainty, even now, that wanting was not the same as safety. There is a steward outside this door who would call whatever happens between us treason, she said softly, and a riverbank waiting 7 days from now for an answer to a question neither of us has finished asking. He went still at that, his thumb tracing one slow, careful line across her knuckles, and did not press further, though she felt how badly some part of him wanted to. Then we answer the question first, he said. Whatever comes after, I would rather it begin honestly than rushed. He left before the watch changed, as always, though this time he paused at the door long enough to promise her plainly that Garrick would answer for the wine, for the grain, for every winter he had spent rewriting the truth to suit his ledgers. She wanted to believe him completely. 3 years of Duskroot in his cup made that harder than it should have been. The hollow moon arrived with a clear black sky and a cold that cracked the river ice into long groaning seams audible from the keep's outer wall. Senna was brought down to the riverbank at dusk, manacled at wrist and ankle in iron lined with something that made her skin crawl on contact, a chill that went deeper than metal had any right to reach. She understood dimly that this was Duskroot worked into the iron itself, a lever built for exactly this purpose, to dull whatever bond the wolf had forged in her until the law's verdict could proceed unchallenged. The assembly gathered on the bank in numbers far larger than she expected, drawn by curiosity or duty or the particular hunger crowds carry for a spectacle promised in advance. Lanterns lined the frozen shore in a long, uneven row, their light catching on the cracked black ice and on the breath of nearly 400 witnesses gathered to watch the law settle a question they had been arguing over for a fortnight. Garrick stood near the ice's edge with the satisfied posture of a man who believed his ledgers were finally, permanently, balanced. "Let it be known," he announced to the gathered hall, his voice carrying easily across the frozen water, "that the law of Korath does not bend for a king's wandering attention. A condemned thief remains condemned, wolf bond or no wolf bond, and tonight the ice will settle what sentiment alone cannot." It was the third time her name had been wrapped in his contempt before witnesses, and this time it landed differently, not as humiliation, but as confirmation of exactly how far Garrick was willing to go to keep his crimes buried beneath someone else's verdict. Senna searched the gathered faces for the king and did not find him. Captain Edrin stood near the front with an expression carved from stone, and beside him Pell, too old to be permitted close but present anyway, his weathered face stricken in a way that told her he had run out of bread and broth and small kindnesses to offer. There was nothing left now but the cold, the ice, and a steward's 3 years of careful lies about to be made permanent. The guards walked her to the edge of the broken ice, where a wide, dark seam of river water moved beneath the surface like something patient and waiting. Senna's hands, manacled and dusk root dulled, had gone past feeling into a kind of distant numbness, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was not meant to be survivable. The thief's death had never been designed as a test of innocence. It was designed as an ending dressed up as a verdict. She thought, in the last clear moment before the guard's hands found her shoulders, of her mother's notes, of the tincture 3 plain ingredients could make, of a small glass vial Pell had pressed into her palm 2 nights before, with instructions to use it only if the dusk root ever threatened to take more than it had already taken. She had hidden it in the lining of her sleeve, a single desperate insurance against a night she had hoped would not come. It had come. She drank it now, fast and bitter, her bound hands shaking too badly to be discreet about it, and felt the duskroot's cold grip loosen in her blood almost at once, replaced by a different kind of fire entirely, the bond beneath her ribs flaring back to full strength, like a banked coal finally given air. The guards noticed too late to stop her. She threw herself sideways, away from the ice's edge, calling a single word into the dark that she had not planned to say aloud and could not have stopped herself from saying anyway. His name. What answered her was not a sound so much as a pressure, a great gathering weight rolling down from the direction of the keep that made every lantern on the riverbank gutter low and every gathered head turn as one. The keep's outer gate, 2 centuries of oak and iron, came apart at the hinges with a crack that rolled across the frozen water like the river splitting open all over again, and through the gap, backlit by torchlight and framed by a sky gone suddenly, impossibly bright with the hollow moon's full, unclouded face, came the king's wolf at a dead run, black-furred and enormous, trailing Captain Edrin's elite guard at his flank like a storm trailing its own thunder. The assembly did not kneel at first. They simply went still, the way a crowd goes still when it understands, all at once, that the spectacle it gathered to watch has become something far larger than anyone planned. The wolf reached her before the guards could decide whether to intervene, placing his great body between Senna and the ice's edge with a sound that needed no translation, and then, in the space of one indrawn breath the entire riverbank seemed to share, the wolf was gone, and the king stood in his place instead, breathing hard, his coat torn at the shoulder where the change had taken it, his gray eyes finding hers across the few feet of frozen ground that separated them. He crossed that distance in 2 strides and dropped to one knee in the snow before her, his bare hand closing over her manacled wrists with a grip that asked forgiveness for every night he had not come fast enough. "Mine," he said. It was the only word he managed, rough and unelaborated. The single short claim a man who had spent 11 nights and 3 years guarding every other feeling finally let himself speak aloud before a watching world. No one on the riverbank moved. The wind off the broken ice was the only sound for the length of a long-held breath, the lanterns guttering low and steadying again, the king still kneeling with her bound wrists cradled against his chest as though letting go of them even now might cost him everything a second time. "She is mine," he said again, quieter now, "and any law that says otherwise was written by a man with poison still on his hands." The hall and the riverbank both understood, in the silence that followed, exactly which man he meant. Garrick's face, when Senna finally looked past the king's shoulder to find it, had gone the particular gray of a man watching 3 years of careful lies collapse in the space of one sentence. He opened his mouth to argue the law, the ledgers, the grain count, and got no further than a single syllable before Captain Edrin's guard had him by both arms, and before Doran stepped forward from the crowd with an expression that had shed every trace of skepticism it carried into the evening. "The Korath Treaty," Doran said, his voice carrying easily in the new silence, "requires a stable crown. I have watched that crown poisoned for 3 years by the man standing in chains, and I will not put my seal to any agreement that leaves him free to pour another cup." It took very little after that. The grain ledgers, recovered from Garrick's own chambers within the hour by men who no longer needed his permission to search them, showed every shortage traced back to the same hand. Every winter's missing weight diverted into accounts that bore the steward's mark and no one else's. The dusk root itself, a store of it found among his effects matching the bitter root pressed into the king's wine for 3 years running, needed no further proof beyond its own existence. Garrick Thane was given the same law he had tried to use against her. Tried before the same assembly he had gathered to watch her die, and found guilty of poisoning a king and framing 2 generations of an innocent family before the night was through. He did not survive the dawn that followed. Korath's justice, the king decreed, would be swift where Garrick's had been slow and cruel, and no one on that riverbank argued the sentence was anything but earned. 3 years the king had stood mateless, his wolf silenced by a steward's careful poison, his hall convinced his silence was simply grief, grown permanent. Now, on the riverbank where his wolf had broken every chain at once, nearly 400 witnesses bent their knees in the snow, one after another, a long, slow ripple spreading outward from the king and the woman he knelt beside until the entire assembly that had gathered to watch a thief drown instead knelt before the bond that had survived everything sent to break it. Iselle knelt last and slowest, her earlier contempt curdled into something that looked, in the lantern light, almost like fear. Senna did not look at her long enough to enjoy it. Vindication, she had learned somewhere, in 11 cold nights, tasted better delivered by the world than claimed by her own mouth. The king did not rise from his knee until he had stripped the dusk-root iron from her wrists with his bare hands, the metal coming away easier than it should have, as though it too had only ever been waiting for someone with the right claim to ask. "You are not condemned," he said, quiet now, the fury banked back into something closer to wonder. "You are not a thief. You are the woman my wolf chose on the 11th night, and has not once let me forget since, and before this entire kingdom, I am done pretending otherwise." The keep settled into a different kind of quiet over the following days, not the hollow silence of a grieving king, but something warmer, the quiet of a household no longer holding its breath. Senna was given chambers in the upper keep, modest at her own insistence, though Bram made it clear within the first week that modest was a temporary arrangement he intended to renegotiate. Pell refused every offer of retirement the new steward's office extended him, insisting the dungeon still needed someone who knew which prisoners deserved a little more in their cup than the ledger allowed. He visited Senna often in those first weeks, usually with tea instead of broth now, and once with a small wrapped parcel that turned out to be her mother's still room key, recovered from a storeroom no one had thought to search in over a decade. She would have liked knowing her notes saved a king's wolf and her own daughter in the same winter, Pell said, settling into the chair by her window with the particular ease of a man who had earned the right to sit in a queen's company without ceremony. A healer's knowledge has a way of outlasting the people who tried to bury it. Liddy was released from the dungeon within the week, her father's debt forgiven by royal decree, and the law that had allowed children to be held for a parent's failures struck from the Korath ledgers entirely. She visited Senna's chambers sometimes, shy at first and then less so, and Bram, who had never once in 3 years been seen to smile at court, was observed by more than one startled servant crouching low to let the girl examine the iron circlet he wore, as though even a king's crown owed something to the small witnesses his bond had freed alongside the large one. Captain Edrin was named the keep's new steward before the month was out, a choice the council ratified without a single voice raised against it, and Isel's family withdrew quietly from court within the season, her ambitions for the throne having found no further purchase once the assembly that watched her contempt had also watched her kneel. The Greywater Treaty was signed within the fortnight, Doran's signature placed beside the king's with the particular satisfaction of a man who had finally seen a crown prove itself worth the alliance. On the last evening of that winter, Senna stood at the window of her new chambers with Bram beside her, his wolf curled at their feet with the particular contentment of a creature finally permitted to rest where it had chosen to be. Below them, in the dungeon yard, Pell was teaching Liddy to count stars instead of stones, his voice carrying faintly up through the cold, clear air. Senna found, when she searched her pocket, the small chip of stone shaped like a leaf that she had carried up out of the dungeon without quite meaning to. The same one she had stared at on 2 different cell floors while waiting for a verdict the world had nearly gotten wrong. She set it on the windowsill instead of keeping it hidden, a small gray thing no larger than a coin, proof that even the coldest stone in Korath had eventually given way to something it could not hold down. A kingdom remembers what it watched a man kneel for, and Korath would remember, for as long as its ledgers were kept, the night its king knelt on river ice for a woman everyone but his own wolf had been certain was worth nothing at all.